Okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome to the stage the four filmmakers whose films are in that screening. So here we have Jocie Juritz, whose film was Conception, Why I Won't Teach My Son Black Codes. So that's a New York
Times piece.
New York Times piece. And Catriona Black. Catriona, you're at the bottom of my mind, the Gaelic film. This is Rory Waudby-Tolley, first film in the screening. There's Something in the Water, the Lake Caddo film, and Freddie Griffiths film. My dad's name was Hugh. He was an alcoholic poet. So can we start by maybe just talking, each of you in turn, a bit about the sort of process and the conception behind your film?
So mine was part of the second series of Conception, which is a series that the New York Times has done twice now, and it's 6 different films that deal with anything kind of relating to parenthood and like raising children, and it entirely uses live narration from actual people that ask to be in part of the series. And they asked me to do one of the episodes for the second series, which was pretty amazing because I loved some of the ones from the first series, and the other directors that were working in it were like much more famous than me, and so I felt very, very excited to do it. That's how the project came about.
So you were basically just given the voice track? I
was given the narration and a 2-hour interview with Deborah, who's the mother that's chatting, and then basically just told, can you include books a bit? Because she loves reading and that's important to her. And other than that, do whatever you want, which was pretty amazing.
And it was the New York Times.
The New York Times, yeah.
Yeah, and were there mainly British animators?
I think it was a mixture. It was some British, some American, possibly from all over the place. They were quite varied, and I was working with a producer in New York, so I didn't actually meet her in person, which is normal for most of my clients. I never meet them. I don't know about you guys. So it was quite a range, and some big studios, some individual directors.
Great. Okay, Catriona.
For me, it was a very different process. The centenary was coming up of the Islair tragedy, and MG Alba, who fund Gaelic Television, were looking for creative responses to that. And in my animation, I've always enjoyed working with archive material, archive soundtracks, but it's usually been more fictional and a little bit more light-hearted. So this was a really tough one to take on. There are hours and hours of interviews available, which are just really fantastic, a lot of them done in the 1950s, 60s. And I went through all of that, and I didn't actually realise I was doing anything like a documentary. It's not until afterwards, really, that it occurred to me that this was an animated documentary. And, well, actually, during the process, I was really coming up against real problems in the sense that there was very little visual information about what happened, and I didn't want to be accused of not treating it sensitively enough. So I had to do a load of research and then fill in the gaps visually. And in that sense, yes, it was becoming a documentary, and it has actually been described by one person as this is now the visual record of what happened, which is a bit scary, really.
And so, I mean, there are survivors.
Yeah, well, there were. The last survivors have died.
Yeah.
In fact, the last children of the survivors has also died. That was 100 years ago. The boat was actually coming back. It was tragedy upon tragedy. It was coming back filled with sailors who had survived the First World War, and this was them coming home to celebrate New Year's Eve. And that's why there were too many of them crammed on a boat, which wasn't fit for purpose, which was trying to get home in time for New Year's Eve. It sank at 1 a.m, literally yards from home. and it sent up a rescue flare, and people thought it was fireworks. It was just awful. Sorry, I forgot what the question was.
Have you? I presumably there's been screenings for that community.
Yes, and that was terrifying. This is a community that's genuinely still not over it for several generations, and this is what I was using the poem for. Several generations just refused to speak of it. So you've got people today who've only just discovered that they were related to people who either survived or who went down. And a lot of these people they're really keen to make that connection now, but it's quite difficult. Maybe they've got one little grainy black and white photo, maybe they don't even have that. So the community is now in a better place, at least. It's trying to heal the wound which has been festering a long time. But yeah, it was well received. It was well received with the community, thank goodness.
Rory, tell us about your film.
So it came about, I got this email one day from some people in Texas who were asking how much money it would cost to put a bit of animation in a film about a lake. And I was like, who are these people? I don't know. So I was a bit skeptical about it. You get weird emails. So they're like, yeah, I sent them, a number. And they were like, okay. I think they thought it was too much. But then they came back and were like, how about you make the film? I was like, okay, I can do the whole thing animation. But I wanted to sort of record them myself because I think otherwise it's... I didn't know who they were, so I was like, what's this going to be? But anyway, then somehow they, I was invited over there to record these interviews. And it was basically there's a guy there who is like sort of like a local celebrity in Dallas and owns a load of restaurants. And he has a house on this lake and really cares about the community and what's happening there and knows all these people. So it became this amazing project out of the blue. So I got a lot of freedom within the sort of, I had to talk about these topics, and they wanted it to be funny, but also, I don't know, there's quite a lot of big responsibility because I'm just wandering into a place I know nothing about. And it means so much to all these people, and I'm like, oh God, I've got to try and express everything they want me to do, not misrepresent them in any way, make it funny and informative. So it's like, okay. So I recorded hours and hours of stuff, and it was just a lot of editing and trying to structure it. So I just structured all the sound first till it sort of told a kind of story I wanted. Then I had to figure out what it's going to look like and stuff. But I think it kind of works.
Yeah, and again, like, what's been the reaction there?
They love it. I mean, they didn't really see anything until it was finished. So, they just sat down for like 45 minutes, had a chat. Then 6 months later, they're like, "Oh yeah, that does look a bit like me." So I think it's, I think they really like it. They've done some screenings over there by the lake, and I don't know.
It's helping the cause.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean,
is that lake still as bad?
It sort of comes and goes. So actually, when I was there, they were quite disappointed because a lot of it had cleared up, and we were trying to get really good footage of how awful it looked, and it was just really beautiful. So a lot of the worst shots are stuff they'd shot on their phones before. I think they had a really cold winter; it killed it off, but it's still there. Basically, it lies dormant and then comes back when it's hot again. So I think. I'm not sure how this summer's been, but I'm imagining it's a lot worse this summer than it was when I was actually there trying to get some really cool shots of how bad it was, But yeah.
Wow. And Freddie, obviously a very personal project for you. This is an RCA graduate
it's my
film.
Graduate film. It was basically kind of like a follow-on from, it's like a follow-on from like my BA film, which was kind of, I did a film about like my dad dying and then my dealing with that and not having like a father figure or whatever. But I kind of had these poems, but I didn't really know much about him or like his addiction and the project. After that, it kind of never felt finished in terms of like me knowing too much about it. So I mean, it was like a perfect opportunity for me to discover that. And I kind of got the poems when I was like 21 or 22. And Yeah, I mean, the film kind of started out as a like interview-based project actually, between me and my mum, and I mean I've got loads of like audio of that, and the process was kind of it was kind of, I mean, I think it started as like something where I found this like interesting, so I was going to do it, and then as it went on, I think it actually became like fairly therapeutic for me, just because I think I found out stuff I didn't know before, and there was like closure that came with that. But yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't know. It was like I've lost my train of thought now. To be honest, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it was like a quite cathartic process for me throughout, and yeah, it's kind of like a close the book on that now. It feels like.
And like other members of your family, your mum, how do they?
Yeah,
feel
I mean,
about
it's my mum was like super supportive throughout the whole thing. I think she was actually kind of. Me and my brother, I have like an older brother and a younger sister. We never really kind of pushed to know much about it, because I think it was, we knew that he was like an addict, and we knew that he wasn't probably the best dad ever. So I think a lot of us were kind of sheltered from the full truth. So I mean, I've definitely like found out stuff I would never have found out, and I don't think my brother and sister. I haven't. Well, some stuff I know I wouldn't tell my brother and sister about, but I mean, my sister was like super supportive as well. I think she's young enough for her memories to be very little, so I think she's like interested by anything that is a memory. Whereas my brother, I think, remembers quite a lot, and I think he finds it difficult more so than I do now. But yeah, I mean, as a whole, it was a very supportive family process. Yeah.
So I'm curious what you all generally think animation can bring to the documentary form that live action can't, because I think, you know, just by seeing these films up here, it sort of is quite almost like a unique genre. Anybody want to say something?
Yeah, I think for me, like the best thing about working with animation rather than live action is that you just don't actually have to show anything at all. You could just have like a blob on the screen and say that is the whole meaning of everything you're trying to communicate, and kind of let the audience decide that that's what that means. Because I think with live action, if you're filming it, you've got to have a really good actor and have everything done really well, and that's really hard and it's going to cost a lot. Or you have to have just happened to have the right perfect footage from this thing that you've been recording. But to animate and just show something completely abstract, like, solves so many problems.
Yeah, especially if you want to show a ship going down and hundreds of men on it, and you know that's going to be a Titanic budget if you're going to try and do that in live action. Yeah, literally. In my case, yeah, as I've said, I was trying to recreate something which didn't exist in live footage, and not even in photographs, and that's the advantage that animation gave there. I could and like you're saying, I didn't know all the details. Nobody knows all the details, so you can choose to leave details out. You can choose which ones to bring to the front and which ones are just going to be a nice blurry bit of blue over there.
Such a good secret of just blurry something in the corner. And
Don't give your secrets away.
Yeah, I think you've seen from the films that you can do really very serious subjects that I guess, like you're saying, you can give it a bit more space, I think, and a bit of distance through abstraction and stuff. But I don't really do that kind of stuff when I make documentaries. It tends to be trying to approach it in a light-hearted way, and often use sort of talking heads. So I kind of establish rules that you never see, a video of anyone's face, because it'd break the world you're trying to make, I guess. But also, I think doing interviews is. People behave differently when there's a camera in their face. When you just plonk a mic on the table, you can just let it run, and you get a much more sort of relaxing conversational tone, I think, than if it's like, right, sit here, camera set up, I think they wouldn't say the stuff, well, they wouldn't say it in the same way. You wouldn't get that kind of natural.
So they knew they were all going to be animated.
Yeah, but then they very quickly forgot because they just sat in a room with me asking them stupid questions. So it's sort of, I don't know, it almost gets a more human, natural performance, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that in the subject matter, like, I don't know, mine in the kind of, I don't know, darker subject matter in that sense, I think that, I don't know, especially with something like addiction. I mean, if you have like a documentary on addiction, I think whether anyone's willing to admit it or not, I think there's like preconceived things of these kind of people. So, I mean, if you're taking it away from that and you have this kind of animated context, I think it kind of allows for a viewer to kind of like be on a level with that person because it's not real. Do you know what I mean? In terms, obviously, the audio and stuff would be or whatever, but I mean, this character's a character, so there's no there's no judgment that can be put on that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience for any of the filmmakers here at all? Yep. We do have a roaming mic.
So my question is for Freddie, and as you were making this film about your dad, I'm curious about what you discovered, because you had to imagine his reality, and you gave that to us in a very compelling way. So I'm curious what you discovered, and then in turn how you represented it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just like the realization of maybe how sad not only his life was, but I think because a lot of the poems, I chose a selection of the poems and kind of knitted them together to make this narrative. But I mean, a lot of the poems which aren't selected were very, I don't know, he spoke a lot about his kind of acceptance of death, and this showed like very clear signs of like kind of depression, I think, towards the end. So I think it was more that, I don't know, I think there became something where like I had like a mild understanding of his addiction. I think you kind of immediately think that he kind of threw a lot away, especially having like a family life in that sense. But I think what I realised was actually that obviously what comes with this is like huge torment for him, and I think that eventually killed him just as much as the kind of addiction did in the end. I think that's the sadness really, is just the realisation that I think that he kind of ruined himself, and it's kind of it just eats away of you. Do you know what I mean? It was just like it was a sadness to realise that he went through such a grim experience. But yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I loved all your films. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Catriona more about the poem that's in the film and who wrote it.
That was by Ian Crichton Smith, and the poem is the same name as the film, You're at the Bottom of My Mind. He wrote it in Gaelic and also with the English translation. And it was actually about, he was trying to dredge up the memory of a past girlfriend who he'd just forgotten what she looked like, what she was like. He just couldn't quite get her out of his subconscious memory. And he was comparing that with the green half-light of the ocean floor. That was his subconscious memory. So he's now dead, but I got permission from his widow to change the 5 years to 100 years, and to make that link, so that this is people trying to dredge up the memory of the men they'd lost 100 years ago. And yeah, it worked very effectively, I think, in that context. Although, yeah, often it does need explained. I sort of tried to pack too much into 5 minutes, I think. Thanks for asking.
You have a Gaelic YouTube channel.
Yeah, yeah. I've started vlogging for my
That's
sins.
fantastic. Tell us about
Oh, well, I've not put animation on there because I prefer to do things that take a day and not a year. But actually, I've recorded 3 today. I've been really busy today. I've done one on the Eurostar because I came from the Netherlands this morning, And I've been to the Tate Modern and done. I've recorded a couple on the exhibitions there. And my idea is just, for me, the Scottish Gaelic is really important to me, and it's lovely to mainstream it, to get it into ordinary audiences, just not to talk about Gaelic in Gaelic, but just to talk about anything and everything in it. So that's really important to me. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Yeah.
Freedom do they give you to work on the piece, and was there a lot of back and forth, or were they just kind of like, okay, here's the money, just go and we'll see it when it's done?
They did give me a lot of freedom actually with it. I definitely still like to kind of constantly be checking and be sending things over, and they expect storyboards and animatics, which you may all know is basically a storyboard like playing on a timeline. It's just a really ugly rubbish animation that you use to like block out how the animation's going to look. I sent them a concept design, so I was constantly updating them, but they were really kind of open to the interpretation. I think partly because it was a little bit of a passion project for the producer, and so she was just kind of, and she'd sourced different directors and studios that she already liked, so they kind of handed it to us, and then if you do something really wrong, they're going to tell you and change it. But most of the time it's about how do you react to what this person's narrative is. So yeah, lots of freedom with it, which is great.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I want to ask Rory. How do you decide which bits are live and which bits are not? Because I noticed, for example, some of the backgrounds for the talking heads were fully animated, and then the one that was sitting in a boat, the boat was live. Is that just because it was easier to leave it live? Or was there a more strategic reason for that?
What was my reason for that? I think at that point in the film, I wanted to they were all talking about their sort of specific relationship to the environment. So, I thought having a shot where he's in the boat and then cutting through the kind of live action bits, it kind of ties it together. Maybe, I don't know. I think that was my thought process for that. But I wouldn't have put that shot in the beginning, for example, because then you'd lose that separation of the two, I don't know, dimensions, whatever. Yeah.
That does make sense.
Okay, good.
Also, it was a really good shot as well. Like,
Yeah, plus
I feel like that just looks really cool. I definitely have to put that in.
I just showing off my camera skills.
And your tracking skills.
Some nice After Effects tracking.
Any more questions from anyone?
Hi, I'd like to ask you, maybe all of you or any of you, because it's a animated documentary. When you're doing the animation, are you just presenting your imagination or the pictures from your mind, or you considering about how the audience will get information from the pictures you delivered?
Can you just say it one more time, just to give us brains a second to interpret that?
Okay, sorry.
It was a really good question. I just feel like we all need a moment to.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to ask if, for example, when you got some recordings or some poems, you just have the pictures in your mind and you translate them from your brain to the paper or to the computer, or you have some strategy like you are thinking about how the audience will get the information, and you mainly to do that.
I can go. I personally have to kind of give my projects rules, and reasons and kind of structures. Otherwise, it's just all this stuff going on in my brain, and I have no idea how to kind of translate it and how it's going to make sense. For this piece, I decided that the parts of the kind of script where she was talking about her fears and the things that she was worried about happening for her son were going to be all grayscale. And then any moment that she was talking about like how much potential her son has and how much she loves him and all of his future and how bright it could be, that's when he would start kind of glistening with all these different colours, like he's a little painting that's about to kind of explode. And to set up a rule like that, for me, that's the way that then you can kind of take your ideas and narrow them down into something that actually allows you to make something, and then gives the audience a bit more of like distinct worlds to kind of follow. That's my personal technique.
In mine, I think there's a lot of information that's quite hidden unless you know it's there. And for instance, all the way through, although it's done in drawn in a charcoal style, it's layered up with various images that I shot, like close-up textures from the beaches where the men's bodies washed ashore, for example, or lichen from the gravestones where they were buried. Also, if you saw writing, then that was from the forms that the relatives had to fill in the weeks following the disaster, to ask for money and to explain who they'd lost and what their relationship was to the deceased. And all of this is kind of layered in, layers and layers of it. And people wouldn't necessarily notice. They'd notice the writing, but not a lot of the textures. And I kind of like to think that my film is something that people would want to watch again once they knew that, and to keep looking and to keep noticing new things. And I wouldn't expect people to catch all that first time round.
I think what documentary lets you do, and I guess because all of our films used a voiceover of some kind, you're kind of, when you're editing the sound, at least you've done that first, or we'd have sound to work with, that kind of you're sort of structuring everything as you do that, I think. Like, I didn't really storyboard my film. I had all the sound first and then had to figure out what to do with it. But it gives it a kind of natural rhythm already that maybe you don't have to, at least for me, it becomes more of a subconscious kind of process of what feels right in what place. And, like, you know, all the people have their environments that kind of suggest what they do. And then it kind of comes naturally when to kind of cut away from them and to what they're talking about, and how, you know, so it's often in this film it's like they're telling stories a lot. I don't know if it's like a Texan trait, but everything became all these anecdotes and stuff. I've got so much footage I couldn't use, but it's just it was just like, yeah, all these mad tales. So it's like trying to, like, it just became quite obvious when you needed to go away and try to, like, show that in a kind of comic way somehow. But yeah, I guess every film has its own kind of internal logic and internal language you kind of discover as you make it. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there's like I think that there's certain parts in how I made my film anyway where I'd be responding to the poems, and I think maybe there's parts where I would be like very true to the words, so much so that I think that like anyone who read the poems may think or visualize that similarly. But I mean, I think there's like a point in general, just like in you interpreting it, and then you can kind of like take it away. So I think it's like a nice way of kind of having this reality and then taking it away is like a director's choice of how to do that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's just that's I think what's like kind of good with animated documentary, I guess, is the fact that you can have this kind of almost animated kind of interpretation of what the real life version would be, and then you have this ability to kind of very seamlessly take it out of that without it being kind of like jarring, I guess. But yeah,
I think it allows you to mix media in a more seamless way, because you already know there's this other layer of reality, so then you can just play with whatever's on screen and cut from different techniques without it. You're not trying to establish a coherent world in the same way you would be with a kind of narrative film.
Thank you very much.
I think there was somebody at the back, a couple of people at the back had a question.
Thank you. My question was for all of you, really, but I guess more for those of you who had less of a personal connection. to the documentaries that you were making, I think it kind of links to the last question, and kind of, but more to do with your relationship with the communities or the people that you're interviewing. So, as kind of one of the first points you made was around that animation documentary making is kind of unique in that you have the space and the freedom to really communicate a story in a way that you feel kind of communicates the narrative really well. Do you ever have a concern that you're an outsider going into these communities or going to talk to an individual and that you could somehow misrepresent what they're saying, or you feel that you haven't been able to be true, or you are concerned that they might feel that you haven't been able to be true? And I mean, some of the stories that you were telling are quite emotive and powerful and personal to those individuals. So I guess, is that something that how do you mitigate that? And how, if you're not in a process where you're coming back and talking to these people, and I suppose for you to kind of feel that your art is being quite true as well, you do have to have a certain level of control, but where does the line, basically where's the line as well, I guess what I'm asking. And who controls the narrative, and at what point does it stop becoming their story and become your story?
Can I start on this one? Because I couldn't nod more vigorously. That was a massive thing for me when making this film, because although I'm a Gaelic speaker and part of the Gaelic community in that sense, I have never lived in Lewis or Harris where the Islair tragedy happened. So I was so conscious of my outsider status and terrified of misrepresenting what happened or stamping all over people's feelings, because I couldn't dance around the subject. I really needed to get in there and deal with the subject. So I did spend a year terrified that I would get it wrong. But the more I got into it and the more I researched it and the more I felt connected to the people whose stories I was listening to, I think the more I actually started to suffer the grief as well, and the more I felt a part of that story. And I won't say I was confident, I was still terrified about its reception, but I did not feel like an outsider anymore. I really felt a part of that story, and that helped. And nobody has accused me of getting it wrong, thank goodness.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same concerns, I guess, but that's why it was quite important to me to actually do the interviews myself and talk to these people, because I think you get a much better sense of everything, of who they are, how they would move when you animate them and stuff like that. And yeah, I guess you're aware that they're trusting you a lot to just take it away and do your thing with it. But I guess the producers on this film were from Texas, and the guy who funded it and produced it, Shannon, he knows these people. So what was great about that is it gave me access to all these people who would be very hard to find otherwise, because you can't just find them online. They're like, it's in the middle of nowhere, little fishing community, and the whole economy relies on this lake that's dying basically. So it means so much to them. So yeah, but at the same time, I think they're all such funny people, and like they're aware that it's going to be a cartoony animation. And they kind of want. I think they're happy for that humour to run through it. So, yeah. But I guess it's always on your mind when you're making it. You just have to always think about what the film's saying. And I had conversations with some of them other documentary filmmakers had gone there and made films that they weren't happy with. Because when they saw the edit, it was portrayed as this kind of like creepy backwards place in the middle of nowhere. Like everybody's really poor and it's horrible. This poor lady, these poor people. So, it's like, well, but you talk to them, they're like, what the hell is going on? We're not like that. So, yeah, I've had those conversations with them before making it, which I think was helpful for me and them, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, for mine, it was kind of, firstly, I was kind of visualizing kind of the feelings of my dad. So, I mean, that was left open to kind of, there's no right or wrong answer of that, do you know what I mean? And then also addiction, it's like there's no right or wrong answer of how to represent someone who's an alcoholic. So I mean that allowed me to be like that. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it was like it was a weird process in the sense that because all my knowledge of it's all completely down to story just told to me, and then my kind of interpretation of the poems. So I mean, it was it's a weird one for that specifically anyway, because it's like, how do you visualize something that you've never felt? So it is completely down to interpretation, and you never know, you might find alcoholics who watch it and then completely disagree with how I've represented it, but I mean that's just how the cookie crumbles.
It's a really good question. I think especially relevant for me in this project, because this is a film about a single mum raising her young black son in Chicago, which is something I could never have like first-hand experience of. And for me to say, like, oh, this is what I think it's like, would be, firstly irrelevant and secondly offensive. So I think when you're working on stuff that is completely and utterly someone else's experience, it's about asking whether your personal voice is relevant in it. And I think in something like my piece, like, my views on what that must be like is irrelevant. So how I try and approach stuff like this, because I work on a lot of projects which I just don't actually, I can't live. I try and do research and I try and read around the subjects and things like that and become a little bit more clued up and kind of aware. But also I just try and treat it with like the most empathy possible and the least presumption. Try and make as few kind of presumptions as possible and be as open and kind of kind to what I think that person might feel, and hope that, you don't do something awfully wrong.
Can you please thank the 4 filmmakers?